Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Kupyan, and in this one the Russians have managed to make several advances all throughout the front line from the northern flank of Varvarivka, gaining control over additional portions of the city as well as the town of Varvarivka. To the northeast of Kupyansk, the Russians continued offensive operations, mostly with small infantry groups where they're infiltrating behind Ukrainian lines. To the west of Siversk, the Russians gained control over all of the fortifications overlooking the city. And to the northwest of that, the Russians continued offensive operations throughout the forest patch area east of Leman. In the Kupyansk direction, the Russians continued their offensive operations on the eastern bank of the river and has also counterattacked on the western bank, where the Ukrainians did not manage to consolidate some of their positions on the northern flank of Kupyansk. This means that the battle over the northern part of the city isn't over yet, although the Ukrainians managed to recapture large portions. It is not a solid hold yet, and they still need to consolidate and entrench themselves within the northern parts, where the Russians are not giving up the control of the area and are now actively counterattacking. At the same time, the Ukrainian operations do not stop, and they are also launching their own offensive operations both to the south of the city but also in the western parts, where a lot of back and forth goes through not just the western parts but also the central parts of the city, where some geolocated footage contradicts each other, because first the Ukrainians captured a portion, then the Russians were geolocated there, which means that there's a lot of back and forth and very dynamic front line that is the Kupyansk city itself. Starting out in the Varvarivka direction, the Russians managed to gain control over additional parts of the central portion of Varvarivka, where the Russians have managed to gain control over additional residential streets. In the eastern section, the Russians are here working on outflanking all of these fortified positions and trenches in the southern outskirts of the city to cut them off from the central portion and storm them from their weak point, which is from the rear, allowing them to gain control of these fortifications and thereby the highway leading into the city from the south, from the Doroshenyanka direction up towards Varvarivka itself. As for the northern flank of Varvarivka, the Russians managed to gain control over a vast area. First, they pushed through to gain control over the first line on the eastern flank of Varvarivka, as well as additional parts of the northern outskirts of the streets of Varvarivka, where following the capture of this, the following night, the Russians stormed the positions of the Ukrainians in Varvarivka, both from the north, east, and south at the same time, allowing them to quickly gain full control over Varvarivka, where this geolocated footage confirms the Russian capture of the town, which was a long process taking several days from the Russians' original push into the northern outskirts of the town to the Ukrainian counterattacks and reinforcements being sent to the town from the western flank, where the objective of the Ukrainians was to regain control of it, push up towards Dobropilya, and then launch a counterattack against the Russian forces. However, these forces were all ambushed by Russian drones, being detected one by one and struck one by one until the town was completely cleared, after which the Russian soldiers went into it and managed to gain full control of it, clearing the basements and being present within it. Now, the interesting part about this section of the front line is that the Russians do not really enter these towns with a lot of forces. Instead, what they do is that they send a few forces, a few soldiers, wave the flag around, and then pull back to the forest lines to the east of Varvarivka and into the basements, where the objective is simply to be present and prevent Ukrainian presence within the town, rather than actually building up their forces in the area, as their objective is not to storm these fortifications head on, but to outflank them. We are currently seeing the first operations by the Russians as a cross fortification push by the Russians, where they are taking some of their positions along the river line and pushing through on the western bank towards the defensive line, and that is following the capture of the northwestern outskirts of this, the second line of defense, where they're now pushing towards these fortifications. So at the same time, some of these towns, they are leaving them fairly empty, while others, they are building up their forces, where they are picking some of these locations along the defensive line to push through the defensive line and start the battle over it to continue the advances alongside it and down towards Varvarivka. But for the highway itself between Varvarivka and Pokrovsk, the Russians have gained control over the majority of it, leaving just a small part remaining under Ukrainian control on the northwestern outskirts of Varvarivka and north of it rather towards Pokrovsk. To the northeast of Kupyansk, the Russians continue offensive operations west of Chesev Yar and Maisk, where they managed to reach the outskirts of Marova, Fedorivka, and the northern outskirts of Varvarivka. The Russians are attempting to push into Varvarivka to gain control over the town, where they're both pushing from the southern and eastern flanks, where they reach the northern outskirts of the town. They're also pushing through the forest lines all the way up to Fedorivka, The Russians are here clearing the first lines of Ukrainian soldiers and setting up their own positions for drone operators and frontline soldiers to attack the positions of the Ukrainians along these fortifications near Marova, Varvarivka, and onwards in the western direction towards Klunove and Popasne, where the objective is to gain control of these settlements and cut off the supplies to the settlements in the north. Where the Russians are currently working on the road from the western flank of Markova on towards Varvarivka. However, there are still roads to the north of Markova from these defensive lines and fortifications down towards Markova and Nova Markova. However, the locations to the north of it are all in the open fields. That means Russian drone presence in the area will be able to detect and strike Ukrainian vehicles supplying the forces, and this limits the supplies going to Nova Markova and Markova from the northern flank and the western flank, putting additional pressure on these towns from what the Russians are putting them through from the south and from the east. An additional flank is now under threat by the Russians, and with the push through Varvarivka, the northern flank may also soon become a section of the front line. To the northeast of this, in the Siversk direction, the Russians first pushed through from the western outskirts of Siversk to gain control over the first line of defense, and then with a combined push from the north and from the east, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining fortifications and now push through these forest patches and forest lines to the north of Resnikivka, where the Russians continued offensive operations to gain control over the defensive line here to the west of Sviatopokrovsk, all the way to Kalinivki, in the western flank and up towards Kriveluka and along the Siversk-Donetsk river line towards Zakitne, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the road between Siversk and Leman. The Russians almost have full control over the highway and at the same time are pushing through the southern defensive line, creating a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, with control over these settlements alongside the Siversk-Donetsk river line and the fortifications to the southwest of Siversk. Russians would have a somewhat safe highway connection between Siversk and Leman to strengthen defense operations towards the city from the southeast. This will allow additional supply lines leading to the eastern flank of Leman, in addition to the ones going through Torske-Sarishne and the Serbiansky forest area near Yempil. At the same time, the Russians also managed to gain control over additional fortifications and settlement positions within Marova and Ozerna. The Russians here gain control over the western outskirts of Ozerna, pushing them up against the river line and the reservoir here to the west of Ozerna, and push through from the northeastern and northwestern directions, putting the town in a pincer maneuver. At the same time, the Russians are storming the eastern and western parts of Marova to gain full control over the town from both of these directions and push towards the Siversk-Donetsk river line in the south. Again, the operation is to gain control over not just the highway but also the southern flank to create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian positions along the highway between Siversk and Leman. What remains of Ukrainian positions near Resnikivka, Kalinivka, and Kriveluka, as well as Zakitne, are a lot of fortifications, but all of them have Russian positions overlooking these fortifications from their weak spot. The Russians can storm Zakitne from across the river line in the north, bypassing the fortifications, and from the east where they have control over Siversk towards Zakitne from the highway, as well as from Platonivka in the northeast. At the same time, they also have control over Siversk, overlooking the fortifications near Resnikivka and Kaliniki from the northern direction. The final positions along the river line, the Kriveluka town, as well as the fortifications around them, are the biggest threat to the Russian forces, but a push through Ozerna can bypass those fortifications as well, attacking them from across the river line. So from this, Russians are able to bypass all of the fortifications at the current situation, and in the near future, with the capture of Ozerna, the Russians will be able to push through the final ones as well to gain full control over the defensive line and securing the highway up towards Leman from Siversk. In the Kupyansk direction, additional offensive operations take place both by the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to gain control over the northwestern outskirts of Petropavlivka, leaving just Kochirivka between the Russian forces, securing the northern flank of Kupyansk entirely in the northeastern parts near the eastern bank of the Oskar River, where the objective of the Russians is to gain control over the road from Petropavlivka in the northeast through Kochirivka and into Kupyansk, as well as covering the flank of the railway leading into Kupyansk from the north, as well as the small roads in between Petropavlivka and Kochirivka. All will be open for Russian use to resupply the forces within Kupyansk as the Ukrainians continue offensive operations to cut off the supplies the northern flank of Kupyansk and the western bank of the Usk River, where the Ukrainians have managed to regain control over the entire defensive line and the supply line leading into Kupyansk and the western bank. However, the Russians are also launching counterattack operations in that direction here west of Kalinova towards the Ukraine positions near Kindrashivka and the first lines and first patches in the direction. The Russians are here working to regain control over some of the lost areas such as Kindrashivka, which allow for a regained control over the highway leading into Kupiansk from the northwest. However, the Ukrainians still have strong positions in the area and hold on to most of what they captured, but some of their most forward positions along the first lines and first patches were attacked by the Russian forces and they were pushed back towards Radkivka and Kindrashivka. Therefore, the battle over the northern flank of Kupiansk continues, where the Russians are attempting counterattacks and the Ukrainians continue to press on to gain full control over the western bank of the Usk River line here near Kupiansk. As for the southern flank of Kupiansk, the Ukrainians continue offensive operations in the direction of the apartment complex area. The Russians were able to stabilize their positions and strengthen their positions within the apartment complex area, cancelling the withdrawal and pushing back from the school area, as they are counterattacking all throughout the city to prevent the loss of these apartment complex areas and central points, where the Russian objective really here is to hold out as long as possible while the eastern flank work for the supply line access through Kucherivka and into Kupyansk to continue the battle, and at the same time they're counterattacking on the northern flank of Kupyansk. All in all, the Russians are not giving up their positions in the western parts of Kupyansk, and heavy fighting is taking place all throughout the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.